Listen, Kathy, I think we've got ourselves in a bit of a mess. I mean, the first priority once the vaccines became available was to get people vaccinated. Very substantial proportion of people have been vaccinated, and by all accounts, all those people at serious risk have been vaccinated. The vaccine is very effective, so it was inevitable when our release day came, that more people would be moving about, and therefore more people would get pinged. But I'm absolutely of the view that if you've been pinged and you've been vaccinated, you should be able to get on with your life.
So bring August 16th forward, make that happen immediately, in your view?
Well, absolutely, because we already were facing and are facing in significant industries, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in hospitality, whether it's in transport or logistics, we are facing labour shortages. Now, I don't want to start the debate about Brexit, but part of that is because a lot of people, 1.4 million people left the UK. So we're short of labour. At the same time, we're now saying that if you are working, if you get pinged and you may not have any symptoms or you might not catch COVID, you're going to be away from work for whatever it is, 10, 12 days. Well, that's pretty unsustainable.
The thing is, though, double-jabbed people like the Health Secretary are getting COVID still, and they're spreading it. And that becomes a problem in terms of the new variants coming and all of that, doesn't it?
Well, again, let's be clear. I think what we need to do now is we need first and foremost to make sure that those people who are not vaccinated, and there are two classes of people, those people who choose not to be vaccinated and those people who are younger. I understand that it's now available to most young people, but a large proportion of them don't seem to want it. So my view is, why don't we incentivize them? The second point is that we should make it clear, almost like a stick and a carrot. Incentivize them on the one hand with the carrot, and a stick on the other side, which says if you're not vaccinated, you cannot participate fully in the day-to-day activities of the UK.
You know a thing about how to sell things, of course, with your position as a retailer. How would you suggest incentivising young people to get the vaccine?
I'd give them 250 quid. Come in, jab in one hand, check in the other.
And you think that would make a difference?
Well, I think it would. I think if I was a young student and thinking about shall I or shan't I, and somebody offered me £250 to go and do something, the cost of the government would be negligible. We've spent billions and billions and billions of pounds on this COVID crisis.
We started this conversation with your comment that we're in a bit of a mess, to use your words. I wonder, just standing back, what you think of the government's handling of this phase of the pandemic.
Well, I think the real serious problem is, and I don't pretend that I'd be any better at it, other than the fact that I do come from an industry which communicates pretty well. Retailers are pretty good communicators. The government's communication has been pretty inept, particularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks. We're either free or we're not free. We're now either actually legally obliged to do something. Apparently now we're not illegally obliged, but we're putting huge moral pressure on companies to make the decision for the government. So I think people are totally confused. I myself, if you locked me in a room today and told me my life depended on it, could not write down to you every rule and regulation about what I'm supposed to do and what I'm not supposed to do. And I regard myself as not wholly unintelligent.
Boris Johnson has been nicknamed Trolley by his former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings. Seeing as you're familiar with shopping trolleys, do you think that's an apt description?
Well, I think that anybody in a position of the Prime Minister, the position that the Prime Minister is in, has got an invidious job. So I wouldn't want his job for all the tea in China. Having said that, my point is the one I've just made now, is the communication across government has been pretty inept. You've got 2 or 3 ministers over 2 or 3 days saying completely different things.
So trolley, pretty fair description.
Well, it's your description, but I am.
It's not my. It's Dominic Cummings' description.
I understand where you're heading.
Just finally, given what's at stake here, would you say it's a fair point that how Boris Johnson handles this third wave of the pandemic will determine potentially the outcome of the next general election?
Well, I think that's the wrong thing that should determine it. What we should be doing, any decision should be only based on what is right for the country today. What is right for the economy today, what is right for people's health today, what is right for our everything today. And that we shouldn't be just making those decisions. I get the feeling at the moment that we've gone from being, let's be amazingly optimistic 4, 5, 6 weeks ago, to being terribly cautious today.
Lord Rose, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Well, joining me from Fife now is Professor Stephen Reicher, who advises the UK and Scottish governments on behavioural science. You heard Lord Rose there talking about the government messaging having been inept. Does he have a point that people are now being left to decide what to do for themselves, and that there's a confusion over that?
in his description. The fundamental problem with the government messaging is, on the one hand, it's telling us that infections really don't matter. So the health secretary tells us there'll be 100,000 infections a day, but that's nothing to worry about. Well, if you tell us that infections don't matter, how on earth can you ask us to do things to stop the spread of infections? How can you ask us to be cautious in our interactions? How can you ask us to self-isolate? How can you even ask young people to get vaccinated if getting infected doesn't matter? And I think the fundamental problem here, if I could just say this, the fundamental problem here isn't the pings. People get pinged because they're in contact with others who are infected. And the real problem is the numbers who are getting infected. The ONS data yesterday showed that 1 in 75 people is infected. That's what we've got to address and drive down.
But might the government have a point that that doesn't matter so much now? Because although hospitalisations and deaths are increasing, they were nowhere near where they were in the first 2 waves of the pandemic. And this wave might have peaked, according to the latest figures.
Well, it matters for 5 reasons. The first reason why it matters is that the vaccines are very good, but they're not perfect. And they avoid hospitalization in between 92 and 96% of cases. But that still means 4 to 8% of people are getting hospitalized. And once you get up to 100,000 a day being infected, that's still a lot of people being hospitalized. It puts a lot of strain on the NHS. Then we have all the problems, for instance, of long COVID. Only in the last couple of days, big study comes out showing that there are big effects on cognition, on mental performance of getting infected. There are all the problems of creating a reservoir when new variants can emerge. And then, of course, there's all the disruption, because even irrespective of what you do about contacts, once you get to about 1 million people getting infected a week, that's a hell of a lot of people who've got to self-isolate and so on. So infections matter. And if we talk in terms of this binary, this extreme which says, oh, we've got vaccinations, we don't want to need to worry about anything else, the problem is we get into a mess where we even undermine the vaccines. So I think the key thing to get over is infections matter.
OK, so what evidence do you have that people are modifying their behaviour, either in response to that large wave of infections or in response to, quote, Freedom Day nearly a week ago?
Well, it was Freedom Day for some. For many, especially the vulnerable, it was actually precisely the opposite. They were more nervous to go out. And it does seem to me, to quote Gandhi, that the mark of a society is how we treat our most vulnerable. We want inclusive freedoms. We want everyone to be able to go out. In terms of behaviour, this is something I've been asked before on Channel 4, and I've always responded the same way, and that because the data always points in the same way. So I'm sorry to be like a stuck record. On the whole, what we've seen in this pandemic is, although the government response has been less than optimal, actually the public response has been remarkable all the way through. Okay, and even now, 2/3 of people think that the government is going too fast. About 70% of people think we should continue to wear masks. About 80% of people think we should continue to social distance, because they recognize in the midst of a pandemic, when infections are spiking, you don't get rid of all your protections.
Just very briefly, does a 250 quid voucher, would that incentivise young people to get vaccinated?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't have negative incentives. That leads to the sense that vaccines are compulsory, and that undermines people getting vaccinated. Positive incentives are fine, but we should accompany them by what always works, what the WHO have recommended, which is community engagement. Go to people, explain to people, listen to their concerns. That's the way to get people vaccinated.
Professor Reicher, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.